So this scripture out of Galatians 5:22-23. So what is special about Galatians? This is Paul's letter to the church at Galatia. And Galatia, just for those who don't know, and I didn't know prior to this, Galatia was in what is part of present-day Turkey, the Ankara and Excelsior provinces of Turkey. So if you know where Israel is and you go straight north and veer off the northeast coast of the Mediterranean Sea, you're in Turkey. And it's just north of the island of Cyprus. And what's special about Galatia and the Galatians, the new church in Galatia, when we talk about the church in Galatia, we're not talking about one building or one church. We're talking about the church corporate through Galatia. Well, there were two different, genres of people in the church in Galatia. There were Jews who were recently converted to Christianity and accepted Christ as the Messiah, but they still strictly adhered to the old laws of Judaism and the Torah in the Old Testament. So their contention was, well, yeah, Jesus is the Messiah, but we still have to be very strict to the law. To get to heaven, you're going to have to, follow the law. And then there were the Gentiles who had no idea about the Jewish law. So they were in the same church, so there was this conflict there. So Paul was actually writing to the church at Galatia to try to kind of put this to bed, put it to rest. So the book of Galatians is about freedom. Paul wrote to the church in Galatia about freedom. Freedom not just from the slavery to sin and death, from which Jesus frees us, but also freedom from the law. Prior to Jesus, there really wasn't a whole lot of consideration about life in heaven, the afterlife, and living with Christ, obviously, in heaven. The concern was, how do we live our best lives here? How do we live in harmony with each other? How do we live our best lives here on earth? And that is through the law. So Paul argued that by purely living in the law, we're living on deeds. And as Christ came, we are now living in the grace of Jesus Christ. We are justified by faith. We have superseded the law. And if we can live in the grace, in the gospel of Jesus Christ, then we are living in the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law. And we're no longer relying on our deeds, but we're relying on being justified by faith in Jesus Christ. Now, I'll admit I'm a little confused. Again, I'm not a biblical scholar, and I always kind of look at the other side and where are the contradictions. And I went back and I thought, well, I remember Jesus said, don't think that I've come to destroy the law or abolish the law or the prophets. I've come to ensure that every letter is fulfilled. And my answer to that, I thought, how do you reconcile that? But my answer is that Jesus and the Gospels not only fulfill the law, but they surpass it. And like I said, we look at the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law. But that's probably a topic for another day and somebody a lot smarter than I am. So when we look at this scripture, I thought, gosh, we've got verse 22, which lists the fruits of the Spirit. And that's really easy. That makes everybody feel good. Oh, the fruits of the Spirit, what's bad with that? And then you go to verse 23, where it says, there is no law against these things. And I'm thinking, why would Paul feel like he had to put that in there? There's really no part of the Bible where it says, Paul went over here and went to the bathroom and had supper at such and such o'clock and all the superfluous stuff. He washed his hands down by the river. Everything in the Bible that you look at really seems to have a meaning. There's a reason why it's in there, and I'm struggling with this. And I think, well, hey, maybe the message is really in the second verse. Maybe the message is really in verse 23. Against such things, there is no law. Imagine the obsession with the law. Such an obsession that Paul felt he had to point out that there was no law against these fruits of the Spirit. What kind of guilt must these folks have been carrying with them in trying to keep all of these laws? And then I thought I kind of see how these comedians have fun with Jewish guilt. It's, we put you through school, we feed you, we clothe you, you leave, you get married, you never call. And it's kind of like Woody Allen. Woody Allen said, growing up, when I was playing baseball, I'd get on base, I'd steal second base, and I felt so guilty, I just went back to first. So what is guilt? I mean, I think we can all kind of agree on the legalistic definition of guilt, that someone is responsible for the commission of a crime or some sort of offense, and that's easy, it's guilt. But think for a minute, if you had to define guilt in the sense of your feeling of guilt, or in the emotion of guilt, how would you define internal guilt? It's a great, big, powerful term, but it's really, at least to me, it's really difficult to define. And if you've been on earth any length of time at all, you have probably undoubtedly felt some degree of guilt. I don't really know of anybody over the age of 2 who probably hasn't felt some degree of guilt. So, what is it about which we feel guilty? Do you feel guilty that you're not doing enough? Do you feel guilty that maybe you're doing too much? Maybe your priorities on what you're doing are taking you away from family or from relationships? Or do you feel guilty that what you're doing, you're not doing it correctly, you're not doing it enough, you're not doing it appropriately? And then ask yourself, are those feelings of guilt really justified? How do we come to terms with them? How do we get from that guilt of having to tell ourselves there's nothing in the law against such things? How do we get from that back into verse 22 of the fruits of the Spirit? How do we get to those fruits? Well, what are the fruits? Fruits are benefits, they're byproducts, they're rewards. So how do we get fruit from a tree? And this is, Darla's up here talking to the kids about fruit. I'm like, man, they're going to think we got together on this and conspired, but we didn't. So how do we get fruit from a tree? We prune it. We cut off the dead stuff that keeps it weighed down and keeps it from producing. And we nurture it. So how do we do that in our spiritual lives? How do we do that spiritually to harvest the spiritual fruits? We can invest in spiritual disciplines. We've got spiritual gifts, which are like discernment and speaking in tongues and all those things we've read about. That's different. The spiritual fruits are the things that we take away as benefits from our spiritual disciplines. So what happens when we discipline ourselves for something, when we commit to something? We reap the benefits. Or if we commit to something that's not good for us, we reap the detriments. So if we discipline ourselves to, let's go back to high school, if we discipline ourselves to lift weights, what happens? We get stronger. What happens if we go run? We discipline ourselves to run. Our endurance, we build our endurance. So if we discipline ourselves in our studies, we learn. So when we commit to those disciplines, we get the benefits. So isn't language, I just think language is so beautiful. So if I discipline myself, if we discipline ourselves, we become, starts with a D and rhymes with disciples. Anybody? Discipline, right? We become disciples. So the Methodist tradition, I love that the book of the discipline, if you're not familiar with the Methodist Church, there is the book of the discipline, how we become Methodist disciples in Jesus Christ. There are 2 main spiritual disciplines that really separate the Methodist Church. Not in a great way, but in a way that really we can kind of claim. There's 2 spiritual disciplines. There are works of mercy and works of piety. And there are 5 works of mercy and 5 works of piety. And don't worry, we're not going to test you on all 10 and you have to, like in school. But they're really pretty simple. The works of mercy, and this is the first one, simply doing good. Just do the right thing. Just do something good. You're 16 years old and this person is having a little trouble getting both kids and the groceries out to the car. Help them out. Just do something good. Visiting the sick, visiting the prisoners. So We have services at nursing homes. Churches take turns going to the nursing homes, the shut-ins. I don't know, there's so many new faces. I doubt there are too many people here that remember Harold Johnson that used to be pastor at this church. I see a nod back here with Kent Powell, Madam Mayor, nice to see you. Harold Johnson, Restorative Justice Prison Ministry. Feeding and clothing people. Every winter, our mission committee has a mitten and coat drive for people, so feeding and clothing people. Number 4, earning, saving, and giving all that you can. And number 5, this kind of took me back a little bit. I had to think about it. Opposition to slavery. There's a high bar for you. Obviously, I think that was probably put in back in the 1800s, but when we think about it, slavery is very, very real today. It's just not very prominent. Many shrimp boats in Asia off the coast of Vietnam are crewed by slaves. Human trafficking is a horrible problem, all slavery. The jewelry industry, and like you've heard of blood diamonds. So opposition to slavery. So those are the 5 works of mercy. And I don't think anybody in here would probably argue with any of those. It would be pretty reasonable. And then works of piety. Prayer. I don't see any controversy with that. I mean, that's what many of us do. Number 2, searching the scriptures. Basically the foundation of everything that we do as Methodists, as Christians. Holy Communion. We take communion, and you don't have to be at the communion rail to take communion. Many communions take place out on somebody's deck on a spring morning when they're listening to birds. Fasting. You're probably talking to the wrong guy on the fasting part. And then Christian community. You showed up this morning, so you have at least engaged, I would imagine, in at least 3 works of piety, according to the Methodist Church. And then number 5, healthy living. All things in moderation. Simply healthy living. Eat right. Take a walk. Things that make you healthy. And when I saw the kids up here, I thought, we're kind of in this age of pandemic, cusp of pandemic, and I'm thinking about, at work, I'm always thinking about contagious and infectious disease. Well, everything that we do from the standpoint of our Christian discipline, when we look at these kids, you think you're not contagious? I remember the first time I really considered the possibility that I was going to be a terrible parent. Our first child, Ryan, our oldest, probably around 2 years old, and we're living in Oklahoma, and I'm in my residency, and we're sitting around a table, and we're just this nice little family of 3, and Ryan's at his high chair, and we're eating, and Ryan looks up, and he goes, "Hey, Daddy?" I said, "Yeah, Ryan." And he goes, "Homer says, don't." I'm like, ugh, Simpsons. All right. So, contagious. They are watching. And when they see these things and when they see the fruits of your spirit, it is very, very contagious. So when we look at these, we see that we already have a framework. We have a menu to reap the spiritual fruits. It's all mapped out. And through these spiritual disciplines, we become disciples. We become fruitful in spirit. And as our hearts turn toward Jesus and as we become his disciples, we have a change of heart. Laws govern our behavior. The Jewish law governed the behavior of the ancient Jewish people. And the laws that we obey today govern our behavior, but they don't change our hearts. When we engage in these spiritual disciplines, the acts of mercy and the acts of piety, our hearts are changed, so our deeds become changes of heart, and our deeds become fruitful, and that's contagious. We abandon the guilt of underachieving, and we become fruitful. We delight in the small acts of kindness and love. We realize that we are placed in exactly the positions and the roles at the exact time to occupy the appropriate time for which we're called. Look at the opportunities we have in our church and its outreach missions. Look at our community. There's the Good Samaritan Center, there are nursing homes, there are schools. Do we have any teachers or retired teachers here? And I'm not going to embarrass you, I promise. Yeah, Christy's here. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So, and it's not a trick question. Have you ever once encountered a student who struggled? Yes. Oh, told you it was easy. Right. So, suppose you can read. Suppose you can do a little bit of math. Suppose you just quietly went to an elementary school and found a counselor and said, if you've got a kid that's struggling to read, if that teacher can set aside a little time, I'll come in at 9:30 on Tuesday mornings and we'll spend an hour reading and comprehending. It's not going to make the newspaper, but I guarantee that kid will never in their life forget what you did for them. And I loved Mother Teresa. She had so many fantastic quotes. And one of my favorites is, and my wife has this on a great big old plaque that she had in her office. And Mother Teresa said, not great things, but small things with great love. So the fruits of the Spirit don't just happen, but there's no law against them. So we should rejoice in them. They will replace our guilt. We can ultimately take comfort in the act that we celebrate this coming Friday, on Good Friday, and then ultimately the celebration on Easter to take away all of our spiritual guilt. And in closing, I don't know if you've heard this or not. Maybe everybody's heard it, and it's just kind of unique to me. Have you ever heard the blessing, the old Jewish blessing of "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi"? Has anybody ever heard that? Yeah, I see some nods. Hey, all right, cool. Back in the day, school was basically a bunch of boys that competed to see who would go with a certain rabbi, and it was like, this one's the most sought after, and they only take so many, and then there's another rabbi. So you had a rabbi, and these boys would follow the rabbi around, and they would try to stay so close to that rabbi so they could hear every word that rabbi said, and they could absorb every bit of knowledge that that rabbi would give them so they could be smart and be educated in the Jewish faith. And so they would follow so close as the rabbi would walk along that the rabbi's sandals would kick up dust, and these boys would be covered in the dust of their rabbi. So, hence the phrase, "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi." Well, our rabbi has chosen us, and we get to choose our rabbi. So, the message to take with you this morning, may we all be covered in the dust of our rabbi.